In the previous video, we mentioned an apparent contradiction in the words of the Rambam. In the laws of Shemitah v'Yovel, he mentions that Bnei Levi, and by extension Torah scholars, would be exempt from war because of their engagement in Avodat Hashem. However, in Hilchot Melachim, where the Rambam deals at length with the laws of war and those who are exempt from war, he mentions no such exemption. And in fact, he seems to directly indicate that Kohanim are actually involved in going out to war. That being said, how exactly do we reconcile this apparent contradiction in the Rambam? So the Shut Yad Ephraim differentiates between wars that have to do with conquering the land of Israel and wars that do not have to do with conquering the land of Israel, because the Kohanim and the Leviim don't get a chelek in the land of Israel, so they don't have to fight the wars to conquer it. However, when it came to fighting Midian, they did participate because that did not have to do with Kibush Haaretz. Now, the Amar Yosef comments on the Rambam there in Hilchot Shemitah v'Yovel and offers a different reconciliation, differentiating between a Melchemet Reshut versus a Melchemet Mitzvah. A Melchemet Reshut is not one that we have to fight, just one that we have permission to fight. However, when it comes to a war that we have to fight, for example, a war against Amalek, a war against one of the 7 nations occupying the land of Israel, or a war aimed to protect Klal Yisrael under threat, these, even Kohanim, and by extension, perhaps Torah scholars, would have to fight in. The issue with the Amar Yosef's suggestion is that we already saw in the previous video, it does seem from the Rambam that he requires Kohanim and Leviim to participate in a Melchemet Reshut as well. Why do I say that? First of all, he writes straight out that if a Kohen Gadol marries a widow or a normal Kohen marries a divorcee, they are not exempt from battle. So if they're not exempt from battle, that seems to imply that they have to fight in the war. Now, the Rambam only discusses this in the context of a Melchemet Reshut. He seems to think that Kohanim and Leviim participate and even have to participate in a Melchemet Reshut. Similarly, Rav Chaim Kanievsky suggests a different reconciliation, that all the other exemptions from the army, you're not exempt, but you could do it. You're exempt and you cannot do it. When it comes to Kohanim and Torah scholars, however, you're exempt and you can do it. They have the option to volunteer. But again, that's difficult with the words of the Rambam, who seems to imply that they are, in fact, obligated to fight, since they do not have an exemption based on being in the first year of marriage to someone that they should not have married. So these attempts to reconcile the Rambam's words do not work so well within the Rambam. Rav Soloveitchik has suggested a different reconciliation, that they are obligated to fight, however, they're the last ones drafted. They are not exempt, but they're the last ones drafted. So, as long as you don't need them in order to succeed, you don't draft them. However, if we're going to lose, if you don't draft the Kohanim and Leviim, then they would be drafted. Now, that's an interesting point from a halachic perspective. It seems not to have to do very much with the words of the Rambam, not in Shemitah v'Yovel and not in Melachim, as they don't address the fact that the Rambam actually says that they are exempt in Shemitah v'Yovel and doesn't give any qualification for it, and he actually does not mention them at all whatsoever as an exemption, and seems to imply directly that they are drafted, and doesn't mention any distinction in whether they're necessary or not. So it's an interesting insight halachically, but it doesn't actually seem to resolve the contradiction between the sources. In fact, the person who I think does the best job of reconciling between the different pieces in the Rambam is Rav Kook. So I'll explain Rav Kook's opinion and why I think that it does the best job of reconciling the Rambam's apparent contradictory opinion. Rav Kook writes that there are different types of wars. There are wars waged by all of Klal Yisrael that we spoke about, and then there are wars that are waged by individuals. Individuals can mean a person, a family, a shevet, and the purpose of those wars are either to defend the territory that they have from an attacker, which we do not call all of Klal Yisrael to help them out with necessarily. Alternatively, if a family or a shevet needs more territory because they're particularly abundant, then they're allowed to conquer more territory. Now, normally, as a nation, we can conquer more territory. That's called a Milchemet Reshut, and that's done on a national level. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about one family or one Shevet conquering more territory, not for all of Klal Yisrael, but for their family or for their Shevet. This is not a Milchama of the Rabim. This is a Milchama of the Yachid. There are different types of Milchamot that we see in Tanakh. Explains Rav Kook that the Rambam meant to exempt the Kohanim and Leviim, and by extension the Torah Scholars, from the Milchemet of the Yachid. And why? Well, it makes a lot of sense. Since this is talking about a family or a Shevet engaging in war for the purpose of conquering more territory for their family or Shevet, then the Kohanim and the Leviim, who do not have territory in Eretz Yisrael, should not be responsible or expected to participate in a war like this in any way. In fact, it works nicely with the words of the Rambam that the Rambam writes that that Shevet Levi does not go to war, does not participate in war like the other Shvatim. That they don't wage war in this way. It's not, he doesn't say that they are usher to or exempt from, as he says in other places. He just says they don't. He seems to be describing the reality that they don't. Now, another reason why I think that this is a particularly good reconciliation of the Rambam to suggest that the Rambam there in Shemitah V'Yovel was talking about individual wars versus national Rabim wars is because this distinction between the two types of wars is first seen clearly in none other than the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchot Truma is the one who makes this distinction. The Rambam in Hilchot Truma writes that what do we consider Eretz Yisrael for the purpose of Truma? Only land conquered by the Rabim. However, land conquered by individuals, like, for example, if a Shevet or a family went out and conquered a land in order to have more land, that's not considered Eretz Yisrael for the mitzvot atzliyot ba'aretz. This distinction between the two different types of wars is first suggested by the Rambam himself. Rav Kook just uses this distinction to explain the Rambam's words elsewhere. Another reason why I think it's a particularly good reconciliation of the Rambam is because we asked, it's extremely strange that the Rambam only includes this exemption in Hilchot Shemitah V'Yovel and not in Hilchot Melachim. But again, if we are talking about a milchama which was waged by individuals, and the Rambam himself says in Hilchot Trumot that a milchama like this, to conquer land waged by individuals, that land is exempt from the mitzvot atzliyot ba'aretz. What are the mitzvot atzliyot ba'aretz? Truma, Meiser, Shemitah, and Yovel. Right? It makes perfect sense why this exemption is included only in the laws of Shemitah V'Yovel and not Hilchot Melachim. Because the point being, a war, a territory that was conquered in a war like this is exempt from mitzvot atzliyot ba'aretz, for example, Shemitah V'Yovel. So Rav Kook's reconciliation works very nicely with the Rambam's opinions elsewhere. It also offers a great explanation for why the Rambam would include this exemption only in Hilchot Shemitah V'Yovel. Rav Kook makes another point there, which is that when it comes to a national mitzvah, Davka, we want the Kohanim there because of their spiritual status. They're able to give us unique koach in battle because of the level of their avoda. We want them there because they're such powerful Ovdei Hashem. The Ramban makes a similar point by the Torah saying in the Milchamet Midyan, we specifically want tzaddikim. Those who weren't tzaddikim have a greater chance of failing and doing various averas, which would result in our failure in war. Therefore, we want tzaddikim who are going to bring about our success in battle. It's an argument to say specifically the Bnei Levi and Talmidei Chachamim should be serving in battle. It's perhaps more important, in fact, that they do. All that being said, I want to offer a couple points in Hashkafa. While it seems to me from the sources that the appropriate conclusion is that it's okay for Torah scholars and Bnei Levi to be drafted, and perhaps even desirable, I want to point out that the arguments against doing so are based in sources and advanced by very, very highly regarded Rabbanim. And it's very important, I think, that we respect this position, especially now at the background for this war being the massive rifts forming in our nation. So I'll point out another couple sources. First of all, the Gemara in Sanhedrin mentions that Yoav and David helped each other out. Because if it weren't for Yoav engaging in military feats, David would not have had the clarity or the peace of mind in order to deal with Mishpat and with Torah. And if it weren't for David dealing with Mishpat and with Torah, Yoav would not have had the clarity to deal with war. They worked together in partnership, and neither of them would have succeeded without the other one. Similarly, the Midrash says about the pasuk we quoted in Matot in the previous psukim, what does it mean, elef lemateh, elef lemateh? Why do you have to say it twice? Says the Midrash, actually 24,000 people were selected. And for every 1,000 sent out to war, 1,000 were sent to daven. Between the 12,000 fighting and the 12,000 davening, you have the full scope of our contribution to the success in war. This, of course, however, assumes that those who are not in war and who are davening feel that their davening and perhaps even their learning is contributing. Not that they are removed, distant, disconnected, and apathetic to what goes on, but rather that they are playing a vital role in what goes on in war. Rav Melamed in Pninei Halacha offers a beautiful insight into a very well-known Gemara. The Gemara in Yevamot tells the story of Rabbi Akiva's students who all died in a short period of time, and gives the reason because they did not properly respect one another. Mipnei shelo nahagu kavod zeh bazeh. The story is shocking on multiple levels. First of all, that the students of Rabbi Akiva didn't know how to respect each other, and also that thousands upon thousands of people died in such a short span. So the Gemara says that they died of a throat illness known as askara. However, Rav Shrira Gaon points out that they actually may have died from a shmad, a decree against Klal Yisrael at the time, and the Gemara was telling us this in a roundabout way. Perhaps because we didn't want to mention that at this time that Rabbi Akiva's students were dying, Rabbi Akiva was supporting a rebellion against the Roman government, known as the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So it makes a lot of sense if we were being attacked by the Romans, and as we know from the Bar Kokhba rebellion, we were slaughtered. Now, specifically, we died of asphyxiation from smoke. We hid in these tunnels and the Romans smoked us out. Perhaps that's why the Gemara chose to use a throat illness to describe the way that these soldiers were killed. Rav Melamed suggests the following beautiful insight. In the time of Rabbi Akiva, when he was supporting Bar Kokhba's rebellion and encouraging his own students to participate in that rebellion, this is the time that they all died. It makes sense, and that they died because they weren't noheg kavod zeh bazeh. But what was this lack of respect that they had? Rav Melamed suggests, well, you had many who felt that their mission was to join the rebellion of Bar Kokhba and fight in the war, and they did so. And you had many who felt that their tafkid was not to actively join the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, but to keep learning and strengthen Klal Yisrael spiritually. They did so. That was fine, except those who went out to war to fight with Bar Kokhba did not respect those who stayed and learned for doing so, and those who stayed and learned did not respect those who went out to war. And it was the fact that they disrespected each other which resulted in the death of both of them. Because if there was a disconnect between those fighting and those davening and learning, they weren't protecting each other, in fact, and the rebellion was crushed, and ultimately that led to the students in the Beit Midrash being killed as well. And if I could just insert my own insight, I think it can't be missed, the parallel between the psukim where we learn the Kohanim's participation in the battle, and what the Midrash says there is elef lemateh, 12,000 going out to fight, and opposite them, 12,000 staying and davening. How many students did Rabbi Akiva lose? 12,000 pairs of students. It doesn't even say 24,000, by the way. It says 12,000 pairs of students. And what I think we're supposed to learn from this is, why was it that those 12,000 pairs of students, ultimately 24,000 students, died? Because lo nahagu kavod zeh b'zeh. If they would have seen themselves as a unit, those in the Beit Midrash and those on the battlefield fighting for the same cause in different ways, then they would have been successful, like the 12,000 and 12,000 who were chosen to fight against Midian, who saw themselves as working towards the same goal. But because the 12,000 students of Rabbi Akiva who went out to fight did not see themselves as a unit with the 12,000 students who stayed and learned, this is what led to ultimately their destruction. So I personally am of the belief that not only can a Torah scholar fight in war, I think it is important that they fight in war and that we would be better as an army with them. That being said, I think it's extremely important, especially at this time, that we note that perhaps the most important thing is that we respect the other person's decision, the other person's position, and regardless, we see ourselves as a unit fighting together on different fronts and in different ways.